It's just metal." My brother actually laughed when he said it. Then he slid a pawn shop receipt across the table. I looked down at the paper, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, because the wedding ring my husband spent 7 years saving for was gone. Sold. Traded away to cover my brother's gambling debt. And the worst part? He thought I'd forgive him. What happened after I called the police changed our family forever. What's the most valuable thing someone ever gave you? Not the most expensive. The most meaningful. Tell me below, because I want to know before I tell you about mine. My name is Carol. I'm 43 years old. I live in a small town in Ohio. The same town where I met my husband Walter at a county fair when I was 22 years old, standing in line for fried dough with my best friend, watching a man in a worn flannel shirt win a stuffed bear at the ring toss booth, and then quietly hand it to a little girl standing nearby who hadn't won anything. That was Walter. He gave things away before he even thought about keeping them for himself. He worked at the grain elevator on the edge of town. He drove a pickup truck that was already old when I met him and stayed old for the next decade because he refused to buy a new one when the old one still ran. He packed his lunch every day rather than buying from the diner near the plant, even on days when his coworkers teased him about the same sandwich he'd had every day that week. He worked overtime whenever it was offered, not because he loved the extra hours, but because he was saving for something. He never told me what. He had a coffee can in the back of his closet. I learned much later, where he kept cash he didn't trust to a bank account his ex-roommate might somehow access, a habit left over from a rougher period in his early 20s that he never fully shook. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. During that time, more than once, he would catch himself looking in the window of Harmon's jewelry downtown, and then look embarrassed, and then change the subject. I never pushed him. I never asked when. I figured if it happened, and if it didn't, I had him anyway, which felt like enough. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until years later, on the night he finally proposed, was that Walter had been saving for that ring since before we had even started dating seriously. Almost 7 years. Not months. Years. Setting aside small amounts from every paycheck, skipping things other young men his age were buying, driving that same old truck because a new one would have set back his savings by months he couldn't spare. He used to say, one day I'll get you the ring you deserve. I told him I didn't need anything fancy. He said that wasn't the point. The proposal happened on the same fairgrounds where we met, 7 years almost to the week from that first ring toss. He got down on one knee in the grass near the same booth, and his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the ring box, and when he opened it I saw a small, beautiful, perfect ring that he had clearly chosen with more care than most people put into decisions that cost 10 times as much. I cried. He cried. An elderly couple nearby clapped, and a teenager filming something on his phone caught the whole thing, and later, somehow, that video found its way around our small town for weeks. People I barely knew stopped me at the grocery store to say they had seen it and that it had made them cry too. Walter was embarrassed about the attention. He said all he had wanted to do was ask one simple question to one specific person, and somehow it had become the whole county's business. Do you still have something from someone you've lost? I'd love to know. Because what I'm about to tell you is the reason that ring became the only thing standing between me and losing him completely. Walter died 6 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday afternoon while loading grain at the plant where he'd worked for over 20 years. He was 44. We had been married 18 years. I will not describe the months after that in detail, because some grief belongs only to the person carrying it. What I will say is that the ring on my finger became, in a way I had not expected, the steadiest thing in my life. It was the one constant object connecting me to the version of my life that had made sense. 3 years after Walter died, a fire started in the wiring of my house while I was at work. The fire department got there in time to save the structure, but most of what was inside did not survive. Photo albums. Letters Walter had written me during a brief period we'd been apart early in our relationship, when his job had sent him out of state for 3 months, and we had nothing but the mail to keep us connected. The flannel shirt he'd been wearing the day I met him, which I had kept folded in a cedar chest for over 20 years, taking it out every so often just to smell it, though by then it smelled mostly like cedar and thyme. All of it gone. The fire chief told me later that house fires like that one usually start small and stay contained to one area, but a draft from an open window had carried it through the hallway faster than anyone expected. The ring survived. I had been wearing it as always, and it came through the fire on my hand, slightly scorched at the band but intact, the only meaningful physical thing left connecting me to almost 2 decades with that man. After that fire, the ring stopped being jewelry to me in any normal sense. It became something closer to the last surviving witness to my entire marriage. My brother Donnie is 2 years older than me. He had been through a difficult divorce 4 years earlier and had never quite recovered his footing financially or emotionally, the way some people simply never bounce back from certain losses the way other people do. He borrowed money regularly from our mother while she was alive, from me, from anyone who would listen to his explanations about why this time was different, why this loan was the last one he'd ever need. It never was the last one. About 8 months ago, Donnie started asking unusual questions about my ring. He wanted to see it up close. He said his new fiancée loved vintage jewelry, and he wanted to understand the style better. Maybe get her something similar someday. I thought it was sweet, honestly, that he was thinking about someone else's happiness for once. Then he asked if he could borrow it. Just for a day. He said a jeweler friend could photograph the setting and replicate something similar without the original ever leaving his sight. I trusted him. He was my brother. I handed him the only physical thing I had left of 18 years of marriage, and he walked out my front door with it in his pocket. Days passed. Then a week. Every time I asked, there was an excuse. The jeweler was backed up, the photos hadn't come out right. He needed one more day. The excuses kept stacking on top of each other the way excuses do when someone is buying time rather than telling the truth. Eventually, I drove to his apartment unannounced. He wasn't there at all. His roommate told me that Donnie had been at a casino 2 towns over most nights that week. I called him. He didn't pick up. I called again. Nothing. That evening, he finally called me back, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has decided there's no way to make what's coming sound better, so he's just going to say it. He said, "Calm down. It's just metal. I needed the money." He told me he had sold the ring to cover a gambling debt he owed 2 men who had been calling him with increasing frequency. He said he'd pay me back. He said it the way he always said it. He said it like a man who genuinely believed saying the words constituted action. Would you forgive this? Honestly? Tell me below, because I am still not sure I have, even after everything that came next. I sat alone that night holding the only photograph of Walter that hadn't burned, a small one from my wallet, slightly faded, and I understood that the ring was gone. Not borrowed. Not temporarily displaced. Gone. Sold to a stranger. Into the world, possibly already melted down or resold to someone who would never know what it had meant. I did not cry the way I expected to. I went very still instead, the way you go still when something has happened that is too large to process all at once. The next morning, I started looking for the truth myself. I drove to 3 pawn shops in the area, where Donnie was known to do business. The second one had the record. The owner, a careful man named Hector, who kept meticulous documentation, pulled the transaction. My ring, described accurately down to the small flaw in the band that Walter had once joked gave it character, had been sold for $240 3 weeks earlier. It had already been resold to a private buyer. Hector had the buyer's contact information on file, as required by state pawn regulations. I also discovered, through Hector's security camera footage that he allowed me to review with the local police, that Donnie had described the ring during the transaction as an old family piece nobody wants anymore. Nobody wants anymore. I drove to the police station that afternoon. The detective I spoke with, a patient woman named Officer Reyes, explained something Donnie clearly had not considered. I had not given him the ring. I had loaned it to him for a specific, limited purpose, under specific conditions, which he had violated entirely. Under state law, that meant the ring qualified as stolen property the moment he sold it without my consent. Obtaining property through false pretenses and then converting it to your own benefit is not a family disagreement. It's a crime. If you've ever lost someone you loved and protected their memory the best way you knew how, subscribe. Because what happened next proved that some things are worth fighting for, even against your own blood. The police contacted Donnie. He came involuntarily, which his attorney later said was the smart move, though smart had rarely been a word associated with Donnie's decisions. When confronted, he still tried to minimize it. He said, "It's just jewelry." I was in the room when he said it because Officer Reyes had allowed me to be present for that portion of the conversation. I said, "No, it was a promise, a marriage, a lifetime." The last piece of him I had left. He didn't have anything to say to that. The buyer who had purchased the ring from Hector's shop, when contacted by police, was horrified to learn the circumstances and cooperated fully. The ring was recovered and returned to me 3 weeks after I first reported it missing, scorched mark on the band intact, exactly as it had survived the fire that took almost everything else. Donnie faced charges. Theft by deception, given the value and circumstances. He eventually pled to a reduced charge and was ordered to complete restitution and community service. Our relationship has not recovered, not fully, and I don't know if it ever will. He has reached out a few times. I have not been ready to respond in the way he wants me to. I sat alone the night the ring came back to me, in the same chair where I had sat the night I learned it was gone, and I held it in my palm, and I thought about Walter at that ring toss booth, giving away a stuffed bear before he even thought to keep it. I thought about 7 years of overtime shifts and an old truck he refused to replace. I thought about 40 years he should have had and didn't get to have, 18 of which I got to share with him. My brother saw a piece of metal. I saw 7 years of sacrifice, 18 years of love, and the last piece of a man who kept every promise he ever made. That's why I called the police. And I'd do it again tomorrow.